Lee told me I only had 10 minutes, so we better jump quick into this. This morning, when reading from Romans, while I appreciate the story and where it comes from, we're not going to be putting it into context. We're just using it to get our minds in the right idea for what we're going to be talking about. I've been doing this study with youth about apologetics, but I also on Sunday nights have been doing a study with them, a Bible study through 1 John. And there's several wonderful ideas that we've been going through in that. And one of those is he was fighting, especially at the very beginning of the chapter, verse chapter 1. He talks about how he touched Jesus, he saw Jesus, he heard Jesus, and he was fighting this movement of Gnosticism, this idea that there was some special knowledge only passed down to a select few people, that the material world was only ever evil and the spiritual world was only ever good. And the reason I tell you all that is because in this, we see in Romans that godlessness and wickedness, people suppressing the truth with their wickedness. A lot of times people have the truth right in front of them and are so blind to it because of what they have in their own minds, what they want to believe. And in 1 John, we also read about some beautiful things, though, how through fellowship we can make our joy complete. Through understanding God, through understanding His Word and His commands, we can know complete love. In the world today, we have this trap that for some reason science and religion are opposites. And I say that, and it sounds like I'm saying that scientists or atheists or people of that mind are the only ones who fall into that trap, but they're not. We fall into that trap too. We like to think that science is somehow an opposite, that it contradicts religion, but it doesn't. A lot of times God made plain to us the knowledge of who He is, and He gave it to us, His invisible qualities, that eternal power, that divine nature through His creation. And so that is why today I've dubbed this, if I can get it working. Can we get to the next slide? Oh, there we are. Seeing the Creator through the creation. Today I want to look at the world around us, the universe around us, and see well, now you clicked it. I'm already nervous enough. Leave me alone.
Now you have 8 minutes.
Oh, got it. We fall into this trap that somehow religion and science are opposites, but how backwards can we be? As someone who's studying to be an engineer, I run into a lot of these types of people that are atheists or at least agnostic types who believe in science and trying to understand the physical world around them. And they almost like to see it like a puzzle, right? It's something we get to look at and try to understand because we don't understand it. We don't like it when we don't understand things. But we look at science and we say, well, they're just trying to study facts and evidence to come up with logical conclusions. And I say, well, look at religion. Religion looks at what we call religious texts, but also that's our facts, that's our evidence, that's our truth that God gave us. And we come up to the logical conclusion. Well, if I read about a God who said, let there be light in a world, and a universe exploded into existence, or I read about a God who wiped out an entire army of Egyptians in a single flood, or came down in the form of man to die physically, overcome that physical death so that we would never have to die spiritually, I think the logical conclusion is I would want to believe in that God. I would want to know that God. I want to love Him the way that He has loved me in that case. And so we also come to our own logical conclusions. But in our faith, in our attempt to know God, to love Him, what do? We believe in a God that we read about, that someone else saw and wrote about. Well, in science, a lot of times they'll believe in protons, neutrons, electrons. They'll believe in cells or diseases that they've never seen or have evidence of, but someone else saw and had evidence of and wrote about. Science and religion are actually very similar and should be used together. We should use science. We should use mathematics and the world around us to understand who God really is. It's not supposed to be this tool to somehow disprove that God exists, but rather to prove that He does exist. Let's do an exercise for a moment. Now we click. Let's say you're on a desert island. There's no civilization, no people, no computers, no cell phones, no nothing. Just you, sandy beaches, and a couple palm trees. And you're walking along that beach, and suddenly a pocket watch floats on the shore. You pick it up, you notice it, you see how intricate it is, you see how beautiful it is. Maybe on the back there's this really cool artistic piece on it. And you say, wow, the ocean did a really cool job of randomly putting this stuff together to make this watch. No, we don't do that. We look at the watch and we say, someone made this. Someone put some time and real intentional effort into making this. And we almost immediately glean some aspects of who that person is by looking at it. We think of, well, how creative, how artistic that person is to make such a beautiful piece. Maybe how intelligent they are, or well practiced, that they were able to make something so refined and yet continue to work. Maybe they're practical if the watch is still ticking after being in the ocean for some time. If they're practiced, maybe this isn't their first watch they've made. This is something that they've had to endure practice and patience with in order to refine and make it just right. So we already instantly glean some aspects of what the person, who the person was who made this watch. And not to mention the fact that this watch only tells time for a single person. It doesn't tell time for a whole lot of people. So it takes a caring heart to make time, to put effort into making something that only one other person could enjoy. So in other words, pouring yourself into one other person takes a kind, caring heart. So how much more could we learn about a God who made such a vast universe when we know a little bit about someone when we look at a pocket watch? Let's think about something a little bit more real. Pi. Now, I know I'm bringing math into a sermon. Please don't fall asleep. I promise I'll try to keep this interesting. Pi is a really weird phenomena in math. It's this really weird number that keeps popping up in all sorts of places. We usually use it in equations to, talk about circles. A perfect circle seems pretty straightforward. It seems like a simple shape. It shouldn't be that complicated, and yet it takes this really weird looking number to be able to make it. And we say, well, why is that? What about this number is so special? Well, in mathematics we call it irrational. Now, I'm not saying that you look at that and it's like, well, no rational person thinks that's a real number. So, yeah. No, I'm saying an irrational number is a number that cannot be simplified into a common fraction without losing information. A lot of times we round pi to 3.14. If you're an engineer, 3 is good enough. But a lot of times, when we do that, we lose millions and millions of numbers through that process. And so how much more do we sometimes look at God and his vastness, his amazing power, but also his vastness and his character, his personality, and we try to summarize him. And how much more also when we look at Jesus, who was God but took on physical form, limiting himself. How much do we try to understand him and yet fail to understand that simplified version of God? We have to take time to understand, to know him because of how vast, how amazing he is, and how irrational he is. And in the literal sense of irrationality, it's not rational that he loves us. It's not rational that he forgives us over and over and over again. That's love. And hallelujah for that, right? That he can love us so much to do that. That's not rational. So we see things like this, these weird equations that we use for a circle, and we say, well, he could have done something like this, made it simple and easy. But no, he threw this weird number into it, and I think that's his signature. That's one of the ways he can show himself to us. So what else about pi can we glean about him? Well, it goes on for infinity. I want you guys to think of a number for a moment. It could be as short or as long as you want. It can be how long it took you to get ready this morning. It could be the number of pancakes you had for breakfast. It could be your social security or bank information. Don't say those out loud. It could be whatever number you want to think of. And pi goes on for infinity. And because it's irrational, it has no pattern to it when it comes to these numbers. And so we look at this and we say, every possible combination of numbers is in there. Well, it may take a while to get there if you have to go down the line to find it. Every possible number is in there. So any number that you could think of about yourself, any detail at all, whether you even consciously know it or not, is in this number. And so how much more does the one who made that number, the creator of pi, know you? Know every detail about you, and an infinite amount of details about you, about every single person who has existed and will exist. How vast is that knowledge? It's almost unimaginable. And so I think this is his physical expression of that, his ability to allow us to, have some chance of understanding how knowledgeable he is and how much he wants to know us. But also, when we're called to have a relationship with him, and he knows everything about us, that feels so one-sided, right? So that calls us, I think, to want to know him, to push us to know about him as much as he already knows about us. And while that may not be possible, we can still try. Just like we're never going to be perfect. It's never going to be easy, but we're still going to try. I like to think of this verse. Getting really dark. It comes from Psalms 139, verses 13 through 16. If you can't read it there, I'll read it out loud. For you formed my inward parts, you knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, my soul knows it well. My frame is not hidden from you when I was being made in secret, intricately woven in the depths of the earth. Your eyes saw my unformed substance, and your book was written, every one of them, the days that were formed for me, and as yet there was none of them. He knows us more than we could ever know ourselves. So we should want to know him. If we're going to really have a relationship with him, if we're really going to try to love him in the way that he's loved us, we have to get to know him. And we can. He gave us the creation. He gave us the Word incarnate to get to know him, to understand him. And I like to think, when we looked at John and when he's fighting that Gnosticism, he's telling us how real Jesus was, how real he is, that he's alive, and that we can get to know him and have a relationship with him. He's not just some distant being that may be all-powerful, but high on his throne and far enough away from us to where we can never reach him. He came down on earth. He limited himself and reached out his hand so that we could have a relationship with him, so that we could get to know him. And amen for that. And so looking at all this, we say, what's the point? Well, how much more do we glean from a watch? How much more do we glean from pi than when we glean at each other? When we look at the pieces of God that live within us. See, I think God's personality is so big. He's so majestic and powerful that he couldn't put all of himself into any of us, despite being us made in his image. And so he put pieces of himself in all of us. In 1 John, we were reading about making our joy complete. How much more do we make our joy complete than by being in fellowship with each other? By, when you look at me, and you try to see God through me, you shouldn't see a 24-year-old white guy. Hopefully you see the joy of the Lord. As I have had nothing but joy this summer hanging out with the youth, I've had a lot of joy hanging out with them, and hopefully they've had fun hanging out with me. So hopefully you see the joy of the Lord through me. When I look at someone like Lyndon, who unfortunately I don't think is here today, so I can't point him out. When I look at Lyndon and I see his desire to know knowledge, to have knowledge of God and want to spread that knowledge to other people, how much more does God want us to know him? When I look at someone like Henry, who I've been living with for a while now, I see his work ethic. I see how much he wants to serve others in his heart. And it's a beautiful thing. And how much more should we want to serve others? How much more does God put himself, in our shoes as the form of man to be a servant, to be an example for us so that we could also be servants for each other? I see someone like Nathan, who has a big personality and knows how to have fun, but is also very caring and loving and knows how to be serious but also kind. And how much more should we be kind and understanding towards each other? How much more was God kind and loving and understanding towards us when we make mistakes, when we fail and sin and sometimes reject him? But when we want to come back, he greets us again with open arms. And so when we make our joy complete, that comes from, when one person lacks in one area, someone else can make up for it in another. And like those puzzle pieces that we try to figure out, we come together and make up a fellowship, making joy complete and literally making an image of God. In 1 John, we read that in following his commands, we get to know him. And when we get to know him, we get to love him. And it creates this cycle that as we get to know him, we love him. And as we love him, we want to follow his commands. And as we follow his commands, we get to know him. And it's just this beautiful, beautiful cycle. And so how much more can we also do that with each other? That we can love each other, get to know each other, but also have fellowship with each other to know him. I think together is how we make that cycle greater. We make that cycle greater by loving each other, by expressing God's love to each other, and seeing those aspects in each other. But how much more also are we called to see that in the world? As great as fellowship is, we're also called to spread that fellowship, to spread that knowledge, so that way we don't just hold it for ourselves. We're not called to hold on to that love and that joy for ourselves. We're called to spread that as well, to bring others into that fellowship. How much more do we try to see those aspects of God in worldly people who put their faith in science or other means? We're called to look at those people and see God through them. They are made in God's image just as much as we are. How much more are we called to bring them into the fellowship? And so that way we can furthermore make our joy complete with them along with us. I call God an engineer, mostly because I'm also an engineer, and I like to think that he's an engineer. But he designed us. He designed the universe. He designed that fellowship and that cycle for us. And he's an artist because look at the beauty around us. The beauty of the universe, beauty of nature, but the beauty in love, the beauty in fellowship that we have with each other. It is amazing. It is great, just as he is amazing and great, and because he has poured himself out into his creation. Today, more than anything, if you get anything out of this sermon, I hope that you understand that we're here together not because we're perfect, but because we're sinful and we mess up. But it is not because we're perfect that we embody God and he is perfect. It is because we are imperfect, and together in fellowship and love, we can make up for each other's imperfections. We can show God's love. We can show God's joy through our different aspects, our different personalities, and allow us all together to have fellowship in a way that he designed, that he wanted us to have, not just with each other, but also with the world. So I'm gonna pray us out. I'd like for everyone to stand, if you would, as we're thinking about this. After I'm done praying, Lee will lead us into our next song. Please just be thinking about, as amazing as God's family is, we're called to make it bigger. We're called to spread that joy and love to others. And we're called to see God's image in others, not just in the body of Christ.